Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video. Good morning, everyone. It's 11 o'clock and we're ready to get started here. This week's class is on invasive plants that are a threat to our natives. And our speaker today is Linda Goulden, who is a master gardener and a master naturalist. And, oops, there we go. I think we're all ready to get started. So Linda, whenever you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Again, I'm Linda Goulden, and I'm going to be talking this morning about invasive plants and how they're a threat to Virginia native plants. I hope to offer you some alternatives to some of these invasive plants. First, we're going to start with what's the definition of an invasive. And we're defining it as a species that is non-native to our ecosystem, that is whose introduction is likely to cause economic or environmental harm to human health or to the environment. And that's the definition straight from the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I'd like to start with a story. This is from the Blandy Experimental Farm, which is our state arboretum. The folks at Blandy had decided that they were going to let some fields naturally succeed into forest land. And so there were several acres adjacent to the current arboretum that they had purchased, and they were going to let it just naturally develop into what they thought was going to be forest land. And what actually happened was that some invasive species, namely buckthorn and autumn olive, took over, and they found that the buckthorn and the autumn olive provided such a dense canopy that nothing could grow underneath them. So they were not seeing the succession that they were expecting. We were talking in the definition about the economic impact of invasive plants, and in the Blandy case, the study that they undertook, they decided that they would remove the buckthorn. And initially, they started with 2 acres of invasive buckthorn. They had to buy a special machine called a forest shredder to take the buckthorn out. The initial investment was over $40,000, and this was started in January of 2022. Now, what they found is that, of course, the buckthorn resprouted. So they're currently studying ways to stop the buckthorn from resprouting, including mechanical work, some chemical means, and some goats. But it's become quite an endeavor at Blandy. They've added an additional 4 acres to the first 2 acres that they started, and this is an ongoing project. So the story of invasives, it doesn't just happen in our gardens and in our yards, but it happens at places where folks are trying really hard to do the right thing and grow trees and allow our normal ecosystems to take hold. But invasives really are a problem. So invasives threaten native plants by outcompeting the native plants, meaning that they grow larger, faster. They can shade out native plants, as this buckthorn did. They can actually alter the soil by altering carbon and nitrogen cycles and changing the soil chemistry. So invasives are really a very serious problem for anyone that's interested in the environment. Here in Prince William County, there are 5 trees that were identified on the top list of invasive trees. The first is our friend, the tree of heaven, also called Ailanthus. The second tree that I'm going to talk about is the Bradford pear, which the picture on the right are Bradford pears that have sprung up along a roadside. They're famous for invading areas that are disturbed. So there you see them in all their blooming, smelling glory in the springtime. The Persian silk tree is the third most common invasive tree in Prince William County, the Albizia julibrissin. And then Royal Paulonia, the Princess Paulonia tree, and I put the white mulberry on there. That's actually on the list as well. So let's talk about the tree of heaven. You will see this, again, invasives tend to do very well in disturbed areas. So you will see tree of heaven sprouting up along roadsides. Here you see it growing along a fence line. The tree of heaven has a compound leaf. So on the left, you see the compound leaf of the tree of heaven. Now, the way that you can differentiate the tree of heaven is it is a compound leaf. It has this terminal leaflet. And on each of the leaflets, you'll find a small tooth. And on the back of that tooth is a gland. So this is the compound leaflet. This is what some small tree of heaven would look like. And this is what you will see on the bark of a young tree of heaven. Tree of heaven bark tends to be more gray than brown. This is an example of more mature tree of heaven bark. It's still fairly smooth, but it still has that grayish tint. The middle picture are some seed pods on the tree of heaven. The racemes from this are carried by the wind, hence it's carried everywhere. And on the right, you have a picture of what a mature tree of heaven looks like. These grow very quickly. They very quickly go from this tiny little bark to the bigger caliper tree. There are male and female trees. The female trees are differentiated in the fall by these large clusters of racemes that get propagated by the wind. There are some native plants, some native trees that we want to make sure we're not confusing with tree of heaven. Staghorn sumac is the first one. And the picture that you see here is a staghorn sumac compound leaf. Again, it has the terminal leaflet like the Ailanthus, but it has toothed edges. In general, the Ailanthus leaflets are not toothed, except for that small gland or the small tooth where there's a gland on the back. Staghorn sumac is one of its characteristics are the red upright fruits that you find in the fall. That's very different from the racemes that you see on the Ailanthus. The other kind of really strong distinguishing factor of Ailanthus is if you break a stem or a leaf, it has a very strong odor. Some folks say that it smells like rancid peanut butter. So it's a stinky tree. And please don't confuse it with the sumac tree. The other native that it's commonly confused with is a black walnut. The black walnut has toothed leaflet edges, so it's kind of serrated all along these edges. Probably the easiest way to tell a walnut compound leaf from the Ailanthus is it does not have a terminal leaflet like the Ailanthus does. Tree of heaven is a little bit difficult to get rid of. There are lots of videos that are out there telling you how to get rid of it. Basically, it requires both mechanical and chemical means. The problem is if you just use mechanical means, if you cut it down, it's a prodigious, it will sprout everywhere. So just cutting it down only multiplies your problem. There is a biological on the horizon, a native fungi, Verticillium non-alfalfae, that may cause a verticillium wilt in the tree, and tests on that are currently being done. It looks very promising so that we could have a native fungi that could potentially do away with our tree of heaven problem. But that's just in the approval process now. That's on the horizon, but it's not here yet. So mechanical removal of the tree is really important, but it has to be done with chemical follow-up. I was actually going to show you a video from Virginia Tech, but it's a little lengthy. So if you are interested in taking down Tree of Heaven, if you could send an email to our help desk, we can send you the very specific details on how to do that. The second tree that I am going to talk about is our friend, the stinking pear tree, the Bradford or Calorie pear. The picture on the left is the reason that it's everywhere. So many folks loved the shape of the tree, the fact that it is a prodigious blossomer. It does have kind of a unpleasant smell. In the middle, you'll see the picture of the fruits of the Bradford pear, and the reason that it spreads so much. It's birds love it, wildlife love it, and so they disperse it everywhere. In the springtime, as you drive around the roads here in Prince William County, you will see Bradford pear along every roadside. There are a couple of fields out in the western part of the county where the property owners were leaving the fields fallow, and they have completely been taken over by Bradford pears. On the right, you see their blossoms. Again, it was introduced as a landscape tree, and it was supposed to be sterile, but it wasn't, and has just taken over in so many places. The Bradford pear, not only does it blossom beautifully, but it gets a beautiful orange-red color in the fall. That's what you see in the right photo. Now, on the left, you'll see one of the thorns that can be possible on a Bradford pear, which makes it a little less desirable. But this is just a little bit about the Bradford pear that it's still sold in many nurseries and plant outlets. So please be aware that it's not one that you want to purchase for your landscape. This is another one where if you're going to get rid of Bradford pear, it's going to require mechanical removal with chemical follow-up. And again, we will give you very specific directions on how to do that. We would ask that you not consider purchasing this plant. There are lots of alternatives to it. The plant is currently banned in 4 states. Both North and South Carolina, Ohio, and Pennsylvania have restricted it from their nursery trade. The next tree that's on our hit list is the Mimosa tree, the Albizia julibrissin. Again, it's a lovely shaped, a vase-shaped tree with very beautiful flowers, very delicate foliage, but all of these little flowers produce seeds, and it spreads very easily. The last tree, or I'm sorry, this isn't the last, the second to the last tree is another lovely, lovely tree, the Princess Paulonia tree, Paulonia tomentosa. This tree is actually blooming now. I saw some out along Highway 234 out near in the mid-county range, not near Lake Jackson, growing up in between the bridge sections over the Occoquan. It's a very beautiful purple, but again, that mass of flowers produces wind-borne seeds that get spread everywhere, and it really likes our climate. The final tree that I'm going to talk about is the white mulberry. This particular tree was brought in as a potential to feed silkworms, but the silkworms didn't like our climate so well. However, the white mulberry did. This one is another one that wildlife loves because there's lots of berries, but it's a very messy tree. You get lots of fruit from it, and it will crowd out our native trees. Now, there are lots of alternatives to these invasive trees, and I didn't go into a list of them for a very good reason, that a tree is a very personal decision. If you're going to plant a tree, you really need to specify what it is, what impact do you want your tree to have. If you're looking for fall blossoms, there are some natives like the Virginia fringe tree or our native dogwood or a redbud tree. Those are all smaller understory trees. If you want a larger tree, we have lots of those that we can recommend. There are plenty of websites out there, and 3 of the ones that I find the most useful, if you are interested in looking for native plants and native trees, the first one is plantnovanatives.org. The second one is plantvirginianatives.org. And then there's a website called Nuts for Natives that also has some very good questions to ask yourself before choosing a tree. Plant Nova Natives has a real interesting section where there are some natives that they don't recommend, and they tell you why they don't recommend those trees. So if you are interested in looking for a plant, a tree to replace something on your property, to replace one of those invasives, I would urge you to check any one of those 3 websites and ask yourself some questions. Specifically, what impact do you want a tree to have in your landscape? I'm going to move on to talking about invasive shrubs, and we've got a whole bunch of these. Autumn olive, Russian olive, the multiflora rose, the barberry, the honeysuckles, and there are more. Spirea is one, but let me go into these specifically and show you some examples so that you will recognize these in the landscape. The first one is the autumn olive and the Russian olive. They're actually close cousins. The differences between the 2 are pretty small, and both are really invasive. You see on the right side the berries that an autumn olive produces, which are great wildlife food, but that just increases the spread of the autumn olive. If you recall, these were one of the invasive shrubs that the folks at Blandy Experimental Farm were dealing with in their reforestation effort. I will say that both autumn and Russian olives have wonderfully fragrant white blossoms that are, they're white to yellowish, they're trumpet shaped. It's a very attractive shrub. Here's an example on the left of an autumn olive. It does have silvery gray leaves. The Russian olive is characteristic for these rather extensive thorns. So both of these have been used as landscaping plants. There are lots of better alternatives. This is an example of a multiflora rose. Now we do have a native rose, the Carolina rose, that is very close. It looks very similar to the multiflora rose. Some folks also call the multiflora rose the Seven Sisters rose. The native has pink blossoms where the multiflora has white blossoms. There's also a way to differentiate the multiflora when it's not in bloom. It has a fringe on the leaf stem where the petiole meets the stalk, and it kind of looks like a cat's claw. So if you have that leaf stem wrapped around the petiole wrapped around the leaf stem, and it has kind of a fringy looking edge, that's probably the multiflora and not our native Carolina rose. The multiflora rose blooms fairly early. It flowers in May and June. It leaves out really early, and it will hold its leaves very long into the fall. It gets some great rose hips on it, some of the beautiful red rose hips, and it is fairly shade tolerant. So this one you'll see as an understory plant in a lot of disturbed areas. If you've ever walked the Bristow battlefield out in the western part of Prince William County, there are some multiflora roses there the size of school buses. The next shrub is one that is still used in the landscape trade. You will find this in nursery centers throughout the county, the Japanese barberry. This one's especially insidious because it provides habitat for mice, which are the hosts to some of the ticks that live in our area and have some of the tick-borne diseases. This, again, is an incredibly common landscape plant. You will find Japanese barberry most common in this reddish color. It gets little yellow flowers on it. There are also Japanese barberry that have variegated leaves, green and white. There are some with more of a yellowish tint. This is one that we would ask you to please not plant in your landscaping. The next one that I'm talking about is the Amur honeysuckle, the Lonicera mackie. It is, it has leaves which are opposite to one another, very fragrant, flowers white to pink, maturing to yellow, and this is a bush honeysuckle, not a vine honeysuckle. So it does produce berries, which are very attractive to wildlife, and the berries are red to an orangey color. There are some other species of honeysuckle which are also invasive, but they may have blackberries. So just because it looks like a honeysuckle and has blackberries, probably is a honeysuckle. These will spread all over the place. They, like so many invasives, they love disturbed soils. Some alternatives to these invasive shrubs. On the left, you see the Virginia sweetspire, the Clethra alnifolia. Great plant, gets really nice fall color. It has beautiful blossoms. Great pollinator, great for pollinators.
It's back.
The 9 bark is shown on the right. That's another one that pollinators love it. It's also really interesting in the winter because it has very interesting bark. Winterberry holly is a lovely plant that's used a lot. You see it a lot more in landscaping now, and it is a native. It's an interesting plant. You have to have both the male and female species to get the plethora of berries. I also have a picture there of the black haw viburnum, which is a slightly larger shrub. There are varieties of the winterberry which will stay smaller. The black haw viburnum is a pretty large plant, but it's very showy, great showy flowers, and you get nice berries on it in the fall. So there are lots of vines and canes, which are also extremely invasive. The top of our list is our friend, the English ivy. Then we've got the exotic wisteria, oriental bittersweet, wineberry, and Japanese honeysuckle. Now, I'm going to talk about these in specific, but I've got a couple of others. There's an organization called Plant Nova Trees, which has really good information. I'm going to go through some of their information on vines. So we're going to talk about a few more than what I listed there. But let me go back to invasive vines. It's important to identify the vines definitively because we have lots of native vines that support wildlife that we don't want to take out. You'll see on the tree that's pictured on the right there a really healthy poison ivy vine. The poison ivy is this hairy thing. Now, I'm saying do not harm poison ivy. Do not harm poison ivy if it's in locations where it's not going to cause small children to break out in nasty rashes. Poison ivy in the woods is great because the birds love its berries. In your yard, it's probably not so much fun. Virginia creeper is another vine that supports wildlife, and we don't want to harm that. Virginia creeper is kind of really interesting because the tendrils that it attaches to the tree kind of look like little gecko feet. Native grapes, we don't want to hurt, and we can recognize the native grapes by the tendrils. Native bittersweet is another one that there is an invasive bittersweet that I'll talk about, but the native bittersweet does produce berries that are very advantageous to wildlife. And then we do have a native wisteria. From the Chesapeake Climate Action Network, their advice on how to deal with invasive vines is to cut the vines at about the shoulder level and also at the ground level, and pull off as much of the vine as you can out of the ground. Pull off what you can on the tree, and always take care not to harm the tree bark. It's really tough with English ivy. English ivy tends to really bore into the bark, so it's hard to pull off. You don't want to damage the tree bark. That's kind of paramount. So here I have the Plant Nova native, the Plant Nova trees information on vines, and this is being shared with permission. I did talk with Margaret Fisher of the organization, and she's more than happy to share her information with us and with the public, because her goal is to save trees. English ivy is really a little tricky because it can have many different shaped leaves on the same plant. The rootlets that are on older stems tend to be tan or grayish, and it can especially be confused with poison ivy because it can get that very hairy looking characteristic that poison ivy has. It is an evergreen, while our native poison ivy is deciduous. Virginia creeper can also be confused for English ivy, so you want to be careful if you're trying to get vines out of the trees that you're not damaging our native vines. Japanese honeysuckle, which you see on the right side, is the one that causes the trees to form those incredible spiral shapes. You can kind of see how it has been twisted. The stem of the honeysuckle actually twists around the growing trees and causes them to contort themselves. The mature vines of the honeysuckle tend to be really papery, and the bark peels off. Japanese honeysuckle is the one that has that yellow to white, very fragrant blossom. This is one we want to be careful not to confuse with native grapes, because the native grapes also tend to have the papery bark. However, their younger vines have tendrils, which the honeysuckle does not have. And we especially don't want to confuse this with our native coral honeysuckle. The native coral honeysuckle obviously can be differentiated by its blossoms, but the leaves behind the flowers clasp the stem, kind of like our multiflora rose did as well. Okay, Asian wisteria is a problem in many of our forests because so many homesteads planted Asian wisteria. It's a very beautiful plant. We do have a native wisteria, so if you really like the look of the Asian wisteria, you might want to replace it with our native wisteria. The Asian wisteria does have the fuzzy seed pods, and this one is pretty easily confused with our native trumpet creeper vine. On the trumpet creeper, its seed pods are smooth, whereas the wisteria, they're fuzzy. The oriental bittersweet is another one that can cause a lot of consternation. It tends to be much more common than our native bittersweet. If you find bittersweet, chances are really good that it's the oriental bittersweet. Mulberry is a common, again, landscape plant, one that you're going to find in your landscape centers right now. The leaves usually are fairly deeply lobed, and it produces the purplish blue berries. Don't confuse it with our native grapes. The berries hang down on our native grapes, while the porcelain berries tend to be more upright. And then this was what I was telling you about with the multiflora rose, where the petiole is curved around the stalk and it kind of looks like cat claws. Don't confuse it with our native roses, because the native roses are pink flowers and they have they don't have the claw-like structure. Here are a couple that weren't on my original list, but Nova Trees felt that it was important that we mention them, the winter creeper and the mile a minute. Mile a minute is one that you'll find in along a lot of highways. It's an annual vine and it does die out, but this is a real bear to pull because of the very fine thorns that are on it. Here are two more that I didn't have on my original list. The Sweet Autumn Clematis. This one, again, is one that you'll find in the nursery trade. It's a very lovely vine, but incredibly invasive. It can be confused with our native Virgin's Bower, which is also a clematis, but one of our native ones. And then the infamous kudzu, which blankets the trees generally a little further south from our area, but you will find it especially along Highway 95. The flowers are real interesting. They smell like grape juice. It creates, or it produces fuzzy seed pods. The leaves actually can look like poison ivy. So if you see something that looks somewhat like poison ivy, it doesn't have that reddish tint that poison ivy has. But kudzu is another invasive vine that you'll want to prevent. Japanese hop and five-leaved akebia are also some vines that you will see that are invasive. The Japanese hop can look like Virginia creeper, but the Virginia creeper is actually a compound leaflet. This is not. This is just a very deeply lobed leaflet. Now, we've got some great native vines. If you want vines in your landscaping that can take the place of some of these invasives that are being promoted by the nursery trade. Our native honeysuckle is simply stunning. It has these coral blossoms. It can be aggressive. Notice I use the word aggressive, not invasive, because it is a honeysuckle. And so if you want to cover a fence with it, it's great for that. Hummingbirds love it. It's really a very beautiful plant. You just want to keep an eye on it because it can kind of take over. The maypop is one of the vines that's really unusual, and it is a native. It will produce a fruit that wildlife enjoy. This is the American wisteria, the Wisteria frutescens. The blossoms are a little more compact than the Asian wisteria, and they're not quite as pendulous. It also doesn't smell as nice as the Asian wisteria, but it's a very stunning vine and very beautiful. If you have the opportunity to visit our teaching garden in Bristow, the area up by the Labyrinth Gardens has native wisteria on the arbor up there. It also has this vine, the cross vine, Bignonia capreolata, which has a beautiful orange-yellow flower on it. And these are two vines that are native to our area. So, moving on to forbs and grasses, there are just too many invasive forbs and grasses to even begin to name. There's a site called the Center for Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health at invasive.org. I would urge you to look there for a really comprehensive list of invasives. Some of the really bad actors that deserve your immediate attention are things like the lesser celandine. This one grows by stolons under the ground. It's tough to pull up. Generally, chemical treatment is recommended for eliminating lesser celandine. Garlic mustard. This one is in bloom right now. If you see this baby out there, pull it up. Each of these lovely little white flowers will produce a seed, and it seeds freely. So garlic mustard, you want to pull that up in the springtime when it's flowering so you can recognize it before it seeds and spreads. Here's our friend stiltgrass. I have a story about stiltgrass. There's an area at the Benedictine monastery that used to be a cedar grove that had lots of poison ivy, lots of undergrowth, some really beautiful wildflowers in the undergrowth of a pretty heavily cedar populated area. That's been taken over by stilt grass, and it's kind of sad because nothing else is growing under these cedar trees but the stilt grass. Stilt grass is an annual, so if you can mow it before it sets seed in the fall, you can start to eliminate it. It's fairly shallow rooted, so it can be pulled, but the seed heads are incredibly prolific, so it will spread very quickly. So again, stilt grass is one that if you mow it at the right time, you can stop it from seeding. It is an annual, so it does have to reseed itself. So consistent mowing is one of the ways that you can manage stilt grass. Japanese knotweed. This is a real interesting plant. It evolved on volcanic slopes on the Asian islands, and it grew in an incredibly hostile environment. So it really likes environments that are not that hostile, and just in Europe, it's considered like the most invasive plant that they're dealing with. So if you have, knotweed is another one, comes in many, many variegated styles. It blooms prodigiously. It spreads by stolons. It spreads by seeds. Once it's established, it's very, very difficult to control. So please don't purchase this plant if you see it in the nursery trade, and if you have it in your landscaping, it's probably a good idea to replace it. Blue stripe is one that has been being battled in our national parks for many, many years. It's, again, all of those beautiful flowers will create seeds, and so it spreads by seeds. It's a real tough one. I know that many of the national parks have programs to treat these chemically. Vinca, this is one of my personal nemesis. I confess, I planted vinca in my yard because I knew that it would grow quickly and cover the weeds, and it was before I knew better. And now I am trying to pull vinca out of places where I never planted it. The fountain grasses, there are Asian fountain grasses that just, you see all those wonderful seed heads, well, they germinate and spread everywhere. And again, they crowd out our native grasses. So you might want to consider some ways to approach invasive control on your property. The basic idea is to figure out, first off, what do you have? What is present in your landscaping that could pose a threat to your other plants and to the environment in general? You always want to give priority to protecting the canopy. That's why there's such a push to eliminate invasive vines. Invasive vines choke out the trees and threaten the canopy in our forests. So that's going to be a priority in any landscaping. You want to keep new arrivals from getting a foothold. If you see garlic mustard sprouting in your yard, pull it before it goes to seed. You want to protect the habitat, and keeping these invasive plants from spreading in your yard and in your surroundings is how we can protect the habitat for our native wildlife. These are all steps from the Plant Nova Native invasive plant management scenarios. So the moral of our story today is to please plant natives. These are some photos that are on the Plant Nova Natives website. This is a garden at the Herndon Friends meeting of all native plants. Obviously, it looks like it's a midsummer picture, but it's lovely. Here's from the Great Falls Library, again, another native plants garden. There is an organization called the Virginia Native Plant Society, and they relate the story of some homeowners who started a native plant garden. They give some very specific directions on how to start a native plant garden. This happens to be the garden of one of their members, Susan and Jim Graham, who followed the directions on how to start a native garden. And the garden that they've created is just a lovely place. That's all I have to say about invasive plants. There's so much more to say, and many of you may have information to share as well. Do we have questions on the chat box?
Nope, there are no questions in the chat box. If someone has a question, you can unmute and ask if you like.
Linda, I just want to make a comment about identifying natives versus invasives. It's really, really important that you do. When in doubt, send us a picture and we can identify it for you. We had an incident in the county last year where utility crew came by to spray Ailanthus in a right-of-way, and they misidentified the black walnut as Ailanthus. They ignored the Ailanthus and put herbicide all over the black walnut. So ID is really important.
Thank you. Okay.
We have a question, Linda.
Okay.
What is the best and most reliable plant identification app?
There isn't one. there are lots of really good ones. If you are fairly new to identifying plants, there's an app called Seek, which is an offshoot of iNaturalist. Seek is really good for quick on-the-spot things. For more in-depth, iNaturalist is one that I use. It's kind of try several of them and see which one works best for you. The iNaturalist is using citizen science. If you're looking for tree identification, there are Virginia Tech has an app, and I can't remember the name of it. Thomas, do you happen to know the Virginia Tech tree app?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. If you send that question to us on at mastergardener@pwcgov.org, we can give you a list of a couple of apps to try.
Anyone else have a question? Okay, I don't see any other questions. Oh, wait. M. Hart said, most informative, great photos and info, and the caution advice on which invasive plants look similar to our natives is very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, again, if you have any questions, you can always email them to us at our help desk, mastergardener@pwcva.gov. Give us a call, and we'd be happy to help you with your questions. Thanks for chiming in today, and we look forward to seeing you on another one of our Zoom classes. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.